Welcome back to Rad City Resin. I've got a really fun tutorial for you today, but first I have a question. When you were a kid, were you a I collect rocks kid, or were you more of an I'm obsessed with dinosaurs kid? If you're anything like me, chances are you are probably a little bit of both. And let's be honest, you probably still are. One of my favorite stones is the moss agate. There's something so alluring about the mix of colors that just makes me want to disappear into the forest. I wanted to try to create a resin version of this beautiful natural wonder. So come along, I'll show you what I did and let's see if I pulled it off. First, let's talk about the supplies I'm going to use. Everything I'm using for this project will be listed in the description, but you can also use whatever you have on hand. I'm going to be using a teardrop shaped crystal mold, as well as a second crystal mold that I use simply to mix my colors in. I used 2 alcohol inks, emerald green from Picasso alcohol inks, and white from Bria Reese alcohol inks. Again, all of this stuff will be in the description. I filled the spare crystal mold with a generous pour of Let's Resin UV resin into the mold cavities, then added a few drops of emerald ink to one and a few drops of white to the other. I was planning to use more white than emerald, but you can really just play around with whatever combo you want. The beauty of this is that you can really make it your own, and you can add more color or less color depending on how transparent you want your stone to be. I gently stirred each color, just enough to create little wisps of color in the clear resin. I didn't want to fully mix it. I prepped my mold by making sure it was completely clean, wiping it down with some alcohol, then using a piece of cellophane tape to clear away any dust or dog hair. Speaking of dogs, my dogs Sadie, Luna, and Juniper all say hello, and they'd like you to subscribe. When I use alcohol inks in shallow molds like this, I always like to sandwich the color between layers of clear resin. So to do this, I pour just enough resin to create a thin film all over the bottom of the mold, and I quickly cure this with my UV light. I wanted to make sure I didn't accidentally cure the colored resin while I did this, so I made sure to cover that with the lid of a box. Now, let's add in some color here. I poured a little bit of the clear resin into the mold, then picked up a bit of the white UV resin mix and dropped in a couple of drops. I let the ink settle and twisted the mold around to make sure that it spread out a little bit, and I wanted to give it the opportunity to sink through that clear resin. I did the exact same thing with the green, making sure that I dropped it not only into the clear resin, but also let it drop into the white resin, allowing it to create a color bloom. You can add in as much or as little color as you want here. The beauty of these natural stones is that none of them look alike. They're all going to have different patterns within them, so there's really no wrong way to do this. You can kind of just let the resin do its own thing. I cured this first set of drops for about 1 minute. I repeated this over and over, adding a few drops of each color and sometimes adding in a bit of clear, and cured between each layer to give that depth of illusion. I did want some of my stones to have a little bit more green to them. I wanted that green to be super vibrant, so I put in just a tiny bit of alcohol ink and then dropped some of that alcohol directly into the resin to give it that deep, vivid emerald color. Once I was satisfied that I had enough layers, I added a final layer of clear resin to the top of the mold and then cured it for 3 minutes. Because I added some drops of the emerald alcohol ink directly to the mold, some of the liquid leaked underneath the already cured resin, which meant that there was a little bit of staining on the mold after I removed my first piece. I could have wiped this out with some alcohol, but I wanted to see if it would create like a veining pattern on the front of the stone. Some stones have those very thin veins of mineral deposits, and I really wanted to capture that concept. I poured in some clear UV resin for the base layer, then I cured it, then I continued on with the same method that I used for the first stone. Thin layer, cure, thin layer, cure, over and over. I repeated this process several times over several sets of stones, basically until the colored resin ran out. I was able to get quite a few pieces out of this little bit of resin that I mixed. I laid the crystals out in the lid of the box, and then I gave them a really good long UV bath to make sure that the resin was fully set. When you're using UV resin on small pieces like this, you definitely want to avoid touching them while they're still warm. Warm resin will feel sticky and will collect fingerprints, so to avoid this, let your pieces cool down completely. When I first started this project, I was feeling very ambitious, so I created around 20 of these crystals in various sizes. But by the time I was done making the stones, I realized that the idea for this piece that I had in my head was probably going to take like a week to finish, and honestly, your girl just doesn't have the time for a project like that right now. I decided to scale back that concept and turn the stones into a really pretty pair of earrings. I tried about 5 different ways to surround these stones with rhinestone chain, and this method that I'm going to show you was by far the easiest. I put a generous dot of resin on my silicone pad. I laid the stone directly on top of it and pressed down so that the resin underneath would flood out around it. I took some rhinestone chain that was pre-measured since I had tried this so many times. Then I laid it along the bottom, and I used my fingers and a dotting tool to nudge the rhinestones into place. I left a little gap at the top for where I was planning to place my connector. I cured this from above for about 1 minute, then cured from the underside of the silicone pad to make sure that the resin was fully set all the way around. Then I left it to cool completely. I repeated this same process again for the other 3 stones, taking care to make sure that the rhinestone chain laid flat as close to the stone as possible before curing with my UV lamp. I actually found it easier to use a larger piece of rhinestone chain and trim it down to size rather than trying to pre-measure. Having a longer length meant that it was actually easier to hold onto the chain as I wrapped it. For each of the larger stones, I left a gap for my connector at the top. For the smaller stones, I fully wrapped the chain all the way around, leaving no gaps. Once I had all the stones wrapped in chain, I turned them all upside down. Then I laid a non-tarnish eye pen along the back side of the stone. I did this with each stone, making sure to keep the eye pen laying as flat as possible so that my connectors would not cause the earring to twist around in weird ways. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, I'm going to show you what I mean. I placed a drop of resin on top of the eye pen, then used my dotting tool to smooth it over the back of the stone, and then I cured that for about a minute. I trimmed each eye pin on the back of each of the larger stones using my flush cutters to make sure I got as close to the base as possible. This left a tiny little bit of jagged edge on the metal, and I used my rotary tool to sand that down. Unfortunately, I didn't film that part, but you could use a rotary tool, a sanding block, a nail file, just anything that will smooth it out. For the 2 smaller pieces, I needed the eye connector at the top, but I also needed one at the bottom. So I created this by bending the eye pin at a 90-degree angle. Then I looped the pin over my pliers in the opposite direction of the bend. I pulled it all the way around the pliers to create a circle. Then I used my flush cutters to trim away the excess at the exact spot that the 2 ends of the circle touched. If you trim away too much, you can just push the loop together using the pliers. I used some very tiny jump rings to connect one large stone to one of the smaller stones, making sure the stones were looped together so that the stones all face the same direction. I used another connector to attach an earring hook to the top of each set. And here they are. I am so obsessed with how these turned out. They look so much like moss agate. I was actually blown away, and I was so excited I ran to show my husband. If you're feeling inspired by this tutorial, I highly recommend giving it a shot. It's really amazing what you can do with just a few materials and some time. Thanks so much for joining me for today's video. Go make something awesome today, and when you do, tag me so I can see it. And as always, don't forget to stay rad. If you enjoyed today's video, I think you'll absolutely love this one. Check it out now.